the thing that I would like to do today is precisely to see how this myth of Versailles and the different ways we use this myth, both historically and historiographically, in a historiographical way, it's working in a very short period of time before the French Revolution and after the death of Louis XIV in a very specific historical area, which is the three monarchies that were supposed to be the most Versailles monarchies in 18th century Europe after the French monarchy. That means the Bourbon monarchies of Spain, two Sicilies, and Parma. The thing that I would like to do today is precisely to deconstruct this, to analyze this interaction and to deconstruct a myth that is being incorporated into the historiography, and that is still nowadays affecting to the way we analyze both Versailles and these three monarchies. Of course, the first thing that I would like to do is to frame my epistemology, to say which kind of concepts I'll be using and how I think we should use these concepts when we analyze this subject regarding these three monarchies in comparison with France. So to start with, I think it's important to explicit which kind of idea of myth we have and how we'll be using this myth and how this myth is used by historians or by common people. The second thing is what we intend for Versailles. What was Versailles, what is Versailles, and what was the Versailles in the 18th century that interact with these two monarchies. And third thing is what is the myth of Versailles, precisely both in history and historiography. To start with, I would like then to analyze very briefly what I intend by myth and how we'll be using the word of myth in this analysis of the interaction between France and these three monarchies. And of course, myth is not something that I'm not the first one to analyze. It's a very well-established concept in the history of historiography that was extremely analyzed precisely in the generation of one of the historians that created the myth of Versailles, Norbert Elias, and in the 20s and 30s with Cassirer and all the philosophy that was going through the creation of the symbolic myths in the history and historiography. It's a very well-established concept in the history of mythologies. So for historical, first thing, I would like to make a distinction between what I call historical myth and what it can be and has been said by other historians, a historiographical myth. The historical myth is those narratives that they create, that they have been created in order to organize a certain symbolic narrative of a nation, of a power, of just a people. We call these mythologies. They are very well established, and they have been very well studied by the religious studies from the 19th century till nowadays. Of course, the three main things that these historical studies about myths are telling us we need to know are precisely the nature, the features, and the functions of the myth. First thing to try to understand, because not all the myths have the same nature, not all of them, they have the same features, and of course, they don't have the same functions. And we need to analyze in a historical perspective which functions these myths are used and for which purposes. Apart from that, in the last 30 years has been created the concept of myth history, which is a historiographical myth. That means how a historical fact became a historical myth, because the historians are using and repeating this idea in order to define a historical process, a historical concept, or a historical event. It's very easy to understand that there are a lot of historiographical myths when we talk about the history of nations, starting with Spain and finishing with France. Of course, the historical myths, they have their own nature when they are created and for which purpose they are created, which features they have, how they are developed, how they are constructed, how they are explained. And of course, there is the functions of the historiographical myths, in which way they function in order to create a special narrative of our special historical phenomenon. Of course, the myth history, as I say, I'm not the first one to use it at all. We can find this word already in one of the chapters of this wonderful book, Le Roi Machine, that is one of the first to deconstruct or to explicit the way Louis XIV was building up his own authority. And after that has been incorporated into, especially into the Anglo-Saxon historiography, in order to understand the interaction between history and historiography in the creation of the meta-narratives of the 20th century. One interesting thing as well is that already in the 19th century, visitors to Versailles, like Thackeray, were very aware of the construction of the myths, as you can see in this famous caricature of Louis XIV, when we can see the man, that means the reality, we can see the myth on the right, and we can see on the left the ways to create this myth. It's very interesting that a non-historian like Thackeray was able to understand how Versailles was used as a historical myth in order to create another historiographical myth, which is the influence of Versailles over the other courts in Europe. After that, after analyzing what is a myth, I think it's important to understand, if we want to really understand the historical character of these myths, what we intend by Versailles. Versailles, it's a concept that can be declined in different ways. It could be a core culture, it's a political model of government, it's a ritual core system, it's a spatial model, it's a material culture of majesty, or it's a building garden interior architecture. All these are Versailles. And usually people don't explicit when we talk about the myth of Versailles, which kind of myth they are trying to analyze. It's important because sometimes in the art history world, the myth of Versailles has usually a positive component. But in the political, for instance, in the political discourse, usually Versailles, especially for the nationalist narratives of the 19th century, Versailles is the countermodel of the modern discourse of national narrative. So it's a very important to establish and to say, when we talk about Versailles, which kind of Versailles we talk. To make things more complicated, even when we talk about building or architecture of Versailles, we need to decide which kind of Versailles we're talking about, especially regarding the 18th century. The Versailles that has been destroyed by the heir of the King Louis XIV. I'm talking about this Escalier des Ambassadeurs that was destroyed in 1752 by the King Louis XV. We are talking about the Versailles that was transformed by the same king. And you can see here the well-known pavilion Gabriel. The Versailles that has been redone, redestroyed, and recreated in the 19th century. And as you see here, one of my favorite images of Versailles, how this palace can be a model with this image here with, as you see, a building that is unfinished in the 19th century, and even the Versailles of the 21st century, this recreation where you have what the Italian people would call a falso storico, a historical false, because this never existed and has been created 10 years ago. So when we talk about Versailles, which Versailles are we talking about? In order to put together the two things, the myth history of Versailles, it's very important to understand that already the man that created Versailles was very conscious about how Versailles would be affecting the writing of history already at the time when he was creating Versailles. Interestingly, this sculpture was not made by a French artist, has been made by Domenico Guidi, an Italian. Italian people, they know very well how to create historiographical myths because they have created several times before the Louis XIV, and it's very easy to understand in the Palazzo Pitti that serve as an example for the Palace of Versailles. And just to let you understand that it's not a new thing, this idea that we need to use the myth to create another historical myth in order to be conscious that Louis XIV wanted to put himself in the line of the other myths like the Roman emperors, not only to show his character, his identity, but to tell Clio, the muse, how to write the history over time. The other thing that I would like to talk about Versailles is that Versailles, like a lot of myths, but especially in the case of Versailles, is working in two directions, in two ways. That's the reason I was saying two directions myth. The first one is how Versailles have affected to the other cultures in Europe, what I call the diffusionist model, which is, we have the perfect example in the Louis Roux books in the 50s that is perfectly embodying this idea with, I love this idea, les satellites de Versailles, like, Versailles in the center and the rest are just where, the sun arrives to tell the imitation of the sun. And as you realize, from the center to the periphery, Versailles will be the center of this constellation of courts. The other one instead that has been less studied is instead what I call the self-referential model. That means that very is affected to Versailles. We tend to analyze Versailles and how Versailles was an example for the court models. Very rarely we analyze how Versailles was affected by the other court models, how the representational culture of the Spanish monarchy affected, for instance, Versailles. There are some examples have been studied, but is usually overlooked. That means, for example, that when we analyze some Versailles phenomena, I'm always very surprised when we study this culture. The French art historians, they study this culture of Versailles. There are very few mentions to other courts or to other models in order to say if there is any ideas or any things that were happening at Versailles that they were trying to imitate on other courts. It's very interesting because, as you realize, and that's the thing that I was trying to do today, is how the other courts of Versailles of Europe will be affecting Versailles is usually something that this self-referential model doesn't allow to happen. It's very interesting because instead, the other thing that is very interesting about the mythology of the mythology of Versailles is how this myth as well, which is the last thing that I will be analyzing before going to analyze the comparison between my subject to going to analyze Versailles with the three monarchies, is how this myth need to be read not only in a positive way, but as well in a very negative way, and how this myth can be used not only to defend or to say anything positive about Versailles, but on the contrary, against Versailles. It's very interesting, this citation, which is very clear, and says, the Palace of Versailles has been turned into a bric-a-brac shop of late years, and its time-honored walls have been covered with many thousand yards of the worst pictures that I ever looked on. I don't know how many leagues of battles and sieges the unhappy visitor is now obliged to march through amidst a crowd of chattering Paris cockneys who are never tired of looking at the glories of the Grenadiers Français, to the chronicling of whose days this old palace of the old kings is now altogether devoted. Of course, Thackeray is talking about the transformation of Versailles in the palace of Louis XIV into the idea of the Museum of France, which was one of the intentions of the King Louis Philippe when he visited in 1840 the palace. As you realize, not a very wonderful addition to the myth of Versailles. Now, set the epistemological frame where I want to place my discussion today. Of course, I will not be in 20 minutes trying to define a very complex subject that needs to be studied, which is the comparison between these three monarchies and Versailles. The thing that I will be bringing today is three examples where I think it's very easy to identify all the problems, or using not in a fine manner, not in a detailed manner, the comparison between Versailles and the other monarchies. The three monarchies that I'll be studying are three monarchies that in the 18th century suffer a lot of transformation. And the first one, of course, is the monarchy of Spain that got Philip V, the grandson of Louis XIV. So we have the Bourbon dynasty established in Spain. And after that, one of the two sons of Philip V and Elizabeth Farnese were ruling in the two Sicilies from 1734 till 1759, Charles de Bourbon. And after that, Philip of Parma, that was reigning in Parma after 1748. Parma, I'll not be studying Parma, but I'm more focusing on Spain and the two Sicilies because of the time. But it's very important because the connection never stopped there. We have Charles of Bourbon that was ruling in the two Sicilies back to Spain as King of Spain as Charles III. So the connection between the three territories, and especially between the two Sicilies and Paris, and Spain are the connections are extremely important. As I said, the chronology that I was using is a chronology that is called the short 18th century, going against the term of the English historiography, the long 18th century, which is between 1715 and 1789. Which is important to use because it's precisely after the death of Louis XIV and the beginning of the French Revolution. I believe that we need to give this time independence in the way to be able to interpret, apart from the things that will be happening later, because the French historiography and even the American historiography and the Anglo-Saxon historiography have a tendency to link the French Revolution with what happened before, and in that way to read the things that were happening before with the consequences that will be happening later. The first example that I would like to use is affecting the political society and how the political society is organized at Versailles and is organized in Spain at the beginning of the 18th century, especially after 1715. I already analyzed this in my monograph, in my book, A New Majesty, and there are several things that is explaining precisely there about the identity of the royal identity of the monarchy of Philip V, defending that Philip V was not imitating Louis XIV, was not imitating even Charles II. They were trying to renovate their idea of majesty, doing something that is very interesting and that happened to be in the rest of the rulers after Philip V and Elizabeth Farnese, which is the importance of the Queen, not only in the creation of the image of the monarchy, but as well in the organization and articulation of the political society. It's very interesting because we have a similar phenomenon in France, which is, and not only in France, in the whole Europe, is the incorporation of women to the public sphere. But in France, it has another way to develop, especially not through the Queen, that the position was not as that one that we have in Spain, but usually through the mistresses, something that we don't have in any of the monarchies that we are analyzing today. We don't have mistresses, royal mistresses in 18th century Spain or the two Sicilies. What we have instead is the Queen, that is not only organizing, because of several reasons, the political society, but we have an incredible reflection in all what is called in the Spanish historiography, the family portraits. You can see here, for instance, a very interesting thing is that you realize that the Queen and the King, they are more or less at the same height, and they are creating a kind of idea where majesty is now only the King, but is the King with the Queen. It's very interesting because, as you realize, it's very well composed. This is by a French artist. Elizabeth Farnese was using French portrait painters in order to create her image, but not using the usual way to create the visual narrative that we can find in the French court. It's very interesting because this was a kind of evolution where we can see another portrait before, that we don't have the painting, we only have now in Stockholm the drawing by another French painter, was. But as you realize, it's very interesting, two different artists, but the composition is quite similar in order to highlight the importance of the Queen when we create the idea of majesty. What is very interesting is that in the most important one, that one that was created in 1743 by another French, Van Loo, we can see now that the Queen has almost taking the center position of the composition, which is even reinforced by the fact that the Queen is in the middle of this semicircle, and the King, very interestingly, is not looking at us, but is looking to the Queen, that she is looking at us. It's a very interesting way to fabricate majesty when you realize as well that who is supposed to bear majesty, the King, is not that one that is close to the crowns, but is the Queen that is very close to the crowns and looking at us. Of course, very interestingly, to demonstrate that it's not a question of his style, it's not a question, it's not even an aesthetical question, you realize that the most important painter in Spain in the 18th century, Goya, in his famous portrait of the family of Louis XIV, is following this composition and converting the Queen in the focal point of the painting using several pictorial tools in order to do that. But as you can realize, because of the geometry, it's very important, the pyramidal way where the Queen is creating in order to highlight this majesty. This is only one sign of the several manifestations that we have of the importance of the Queen, not only with Elizabeth Farnese, but with all the queens that we have in Spain and in the two Sicilies, where we have very two important ones, Maria Carolina, the sister of Marie Antoinette, and Maria Amalia, the wife of Charles III. The second example that I would like to highlight today is the space. So moving from an idea of the court society as a political society, and the creation of the idea of majesty to the how the space is used. Very rarely I use the word of architecture because the space is so important that it cannot only be analyzed by architect historians. It needs to be analyzed in a more complex way. That's the reason I used to talk about a space is not only about architecture. Very interestingly, one of the satellites de Versailles by Louis Roux, of course, is Caserta, that was Merlotti was talking a lot previously. Caserta, it has been defined, and this is Louis Roux, as a satellite de Versailles with the same with these words. Toutefois, il était inévitable que l'avènement d'un Bourbon, fut-il de la branche espagnole, sur les trônes de deux Siciles, servit indirectement l'influence française. Les palais de Caserta, que le roi Charles III fit construire par l'Hollandais italianisé Luigi Vanvitelli, n'est qu'une imitation, d'ailleurs fort réussie, du château de Versailles, vu sans doute à travers les Versailles castillans de la Grange. Now, it's very interesting to see how this palace can be compared as an imitation to this palace, which is Versailles, which is something that it shocked me because, of course, you can see the similarities if you want in the ambition, but if you want to talk about ambition, you don't need to go to Versailles, you can go to Escorial, for instance, in terms of his space. The Escorial was a royal residence as well, and Charles de Bourbon was several times there before going to Naples in 1734. Now, it's very interesting to see how it's very easy to understand that even if the ambition could be compared to Versailles, the composition of these two chateaux, this is Caserta. Caserta is close to Naples. This is Naples, and this is Caserta, just to get you placed because it's not a royal palace that is usually known. Caserta was part of a very complex system of royal residences, was not the only royal palace created by Charles de Bourbon in Naples, and was not actually the most used because he created. So he was most of the time in the other palace that he preferred, that it was the Portici Palace, that is a very small palace compared to Caserta. What I want to show is, for instance, in comparing just in a basic way, the organization of Versailles and the organization of Caserta, we can see that the conception is quite different. Versailles was created through a different aggregation of buildings that they were growing, and as Saint-Simon and another court people were saying, the plan of Versailles that was always on works, never finished for more than 50 years. Versailles, and as you can see, is an aggregation of different buildings, an amalgamation of the different buildings that as well were through expansion, okay, both to the side of the village or to the side of the garden. As I saw before, you can see the problem of this aggregation and the problem of this putting together different pieces in this incoherent sense of architecture, where you can see three completely different types of architecture attached to the same palace. Now, in the case of Caserta, the thing that we have is just the contrary concept, because it's not an aggregation of buildings, but just a concentration of buildings, because this is the original design. This is a building that needs to be concentrated into one block with just a courtyard in front of it that creates two very basic volumes that instead of going through expansion, they need to go to concentrate. It's very easy to see from the engravings that were created by the architect in order to present the volume, where you can see the volume of the block of the royal palace, and how the central point that is just this building in the middle that is concentrating with the four towers perfectly the view as a very concentrated palace, that only in this simple analysis is difficult to compare Versailles with Caserta. If we go through analysis, an analysis of the vertical and horizontal distribution of Caserta, the comparison with Versailles is difficult as well to establish. Not only because in the ground floor we have it's reserved not to the members of the court, not to ceremonies, it's just for the four secretaries of the state. So the state is going to the bottom, to the ground floor. After that, we have the royal apartment where only the royal family is located, and we have all the members of the court in the third floor, which is, as you realize, a little bit like a military building. In other example, for instance, that we could see in Versailles and in Caserta, for instance, the location of the royal chamber. in Versailles after 1700 with the famous Chambre du Roi, which is in the center and organized more or less the space of Versailles, when instead of Caserta, we have it here, that as you realize is not in as one of the main important axes of the palace. And I tend to, because it has been studied already that the Philip V and Elizabeth Farnese decide to respect the apartment of the Queen and the apartment of the King, but they were always sleeping together in the same bed, which changed a lot the mechanics and the social structure of the court. Now, another thing that has been usually established as well is the comparison between the different staircases, how the imitation of the staircase of Versailles was affecting that one of Caserta, though I say again, it's difficult always to say what is similar or not, but you can see by your own eyes, what do you think if it's similar or not? Not only the decoration, but even the narrative that you have in the two staircases are quite different from one from another. One thing that has never been said, but is starting to be analyzed now, is that in order to understand Versailles, probably we need to look to the project never created of Juvara for the Palazzo, for the Palace of Madrid, that of course in the monarchy of the two Sicilies, they were able to understand that this was never built, but was the project that after that developed the actual Royal Palace of Madrid by a student of Juvara. Finally, after seeing two examples how the reception of Versailles could have been received in Spain or in the two Sicilies, I would like to do the other thing, is to introduce an element how we need to see Versailles in comparison with the rest of the course of Europe. Just a very basic thing that I was very surprised not to see in the studies that they are carrying on about this, but the Dichiarazione dei Disegni, that means the different drawings of the Palace of Caserta, they were engraved in 1756, and they were very well known in Europe. We know that they were sent to the court of Versailles, and of course there are several examples in France, and in the Bibliothèque de la Ville de Versailles, there are several ones. And it's very interesting to see just that in the project, the concours that was created in 1780s to transform Versailles, Louis XVI opened a competition to transform Versailles and to carry on with the project of Gabriel. I think that we don't need more comments to realize that there is an interesting influence, or at least the dialogue between Caserta and the different projects of Versailles should be highlighted. If we can see this even outside of the court, this is a project created by Sellerier in 1812 for a Palais des Archives de l'Empire, where I think the influence of Versailles is as well quite obvious. And Caserta was very well known in France because it was introducing two very important architectural monographs. The first one is that one by Durand in 1800, which is the first book, I think, in the world that is trying to analyze the history of architecture from a sense of typology, organizing the buildings organizing the buildings by typology, so churches, palaces, and so on. Of course, Caserta is there. That is the wonderful engraving, because you have, I like this because you have the elevations with the plans and the sections, so allows to understand perfectly the space between the three different dimensions. And this was included in this book. The other book that is talking very well as well, actually, about Caserta, is precisely the book that is the first book, I think, is analyzing, after the end of the Ancien Régime, is analyzing very well all the royal palaces in Europe, which is the book, the Parallèle des Résidences des Souverains, de Percier et Fontaine, that, as you realize, has a chapter dedicated to Le Château de Caserta. And that was very important. They were doing that because, in a very interesting manner, they wanted to study how this typology has been developed in the last 300 years in Europe in order to create this, which is probably the last project of the Ancien Régime as a royal palace, or the first project of the new regime of the royal palace, that is the Palais the Palais du Roi de Rome, supposed to be built at Chaillot, that started around 1811, I think, is the project, but of course after la chute de l'Empereur was never finished. I think it's interesting, it would be interesting to compare Versailles and how they were trying to integrate here the model of Versailles with Caserta in many ways, that when you analyze the project with a free eye, you realize that the central block, it could be, it's interesting, the similarities with Caserta. And when you see the central plan, it's interesting as well, the similarities with Caserta and not with Versailles, not having this usually U shape that you will have in a French palace. It's even more interesting when we see the whole plan of the city, because they, of course, they were thinking great. With Napoleon, you need to do that. So Percier-Fontaine, they were creating this project as well, where you can see these 4 palaces that they will be used for administrative reasons. And it's very interesting how the 4 of them compose a big, enormous Caserta, and how individually as well, they are quite similar to Caserta. Of course, Caserta was not inventing this form, and this form is before. That's for sure. I'm not trying to change here the myth of Versailles with the myth of Caserta. That's not for sure. But what I want to show is the interaction that we will have in a world that was more complex than we usually tend to think, and how the things are circulating both ways. Just to conclude, I would like to conclude with four conclusions, just to open the discussion. I always think that the way to do these presentations is always to present not the results, but just the problems that we have, or the questions that we have when we analyze the past. The first one that I would like to highlight is the need still nowadays for the court studies. It has been said several times, but I see that the transdisciplinarity is more involved than usually exercise, and the necessity to put together words, objects, and images when we analyze something like the myth of Versailles. When people are writing about Versailles, they are writing about something that they are seeing, or about something, objects that they are performing with. So it's very important that we understand when they talk about this object, how is the real object that they were looking at? Because the objects, as you see, they have been transformed by history. The second thing is a decentralized analysis and decentralized narratives, where we don't need to say what is better, what is worse, what is the most beautiful palace in the world or the less beautiful palace in the world. History was not created to give prizes, but history was created in order to understand how the processes have been developed. So it will be very interesting to see how this decentralized analysis will be able to create a new analysis of Versailles, and of course of the monarchies of the two Sicilies and Spain. I think as well that this presentation is advocating for reintroducing history. That means the dimensions of time and space, because when we talk about Versailles, usually we talk about an ideal Versailles, but we don't talk about which specific Versailles. I remember talking to people when they talk about Versailles, I am asking them, you are talking about the Versailles Louis XIV, Louis XV, which Louis XV, the first one, the second one, that one that destroyed the staircase, that one that wanted to create a new Versailles. Last, it's very important to understand, and that's the thing that I was trying today, is to understand the functions of the myths, how the historiographical and historical myths that function in order to create very practical things. That means narratives where people can believe in order to reinforce the personal or social identities that they want to defend. Thank you very much.